And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, author of A Place Between Time and Space and Paranormal Expeditions, Hunt for the Friendship, a chief researcher at Paranormality Magazine, a psychonaut and Discordian magician. He's no high stranger to high strangeness, a far out rambler rambling far out destinations, a groovy groovester grooving the bizarre out there beyond the out there. He's no paranormie, or is he? Let's find out in welcoming Chaz of the Dead to the show. Chaz, welcome, my friend.
What a fucking intro. Thanks for having me, man. That was beautiful. Put that on my gravestone.
All right. Um, I don't know if I want to go that far with it.
It's up there. I might have to borrow that for the next book jacket or something.
All right. All right. I'm making my way into the mainstream one step at a time by people's gravestones.
That's the best place, in my experience as a paranormal investigator. That's the best place to do any kind of advertising or outreach. Gravestones.
All right. So speaking of that, I recently moved to Florida, and this is your home base, Florida is, where you've done a lot of your research, your paranormal research. Well, so I have to ask you, what freaky deaky sites should I explore and why?
Well, everyone knows I'm a big proponent of what I think is the chief location of high strangeness in the state of Florida, which is the Betts house / Neff house, depending on who you ask, which is just north of Jacksonville on Fort George Island. And the island itself used to be a plantation. There's lots of history, lots of museums. Jean Ribault, the French explorer, landed there before the Spanish actually arrived. The Spanish showed up not too long after and killed all the French, and then 40 miles to the south set up St. Augustine, which became the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the Americas. Of course, St. Augustine's got good ghost tours, good history and stuff, but Fort George Island has quite a bit of history and stuff to its own. So right up along that Space Coast is a good ghost tour. North of Fort George Island is Amelia Island, where the country's oldest continuously operated bar is. Lots of good ghost stories there, fun place to drink. Lots of good haunted inns and forts. But right between these two famous, kind of more touristy haunted locations sits this Neff house. And it sits at the highest point in Duval County. And it is, I usually call it the Betts Castle because it looks like a castle. It's got this large spire. It's deep in the woods, abandoned. It's a classic like horror movie set. The first time you walk up on it, you're like, oh shit. Like you're like, oh. It has that palpable, ominous feeling. And then inside the house, it's a bit of a maze. It was built by this famous architect, Melvin Greeley. And he built a lot of famous Jacksonville landmarks, but this was his, what he said, his most unique building. And it is, there's walls that like kind of lead into strange rooms. There's doors and halfway up, 6 feet up off the ground on the middle of walls. There's little rooms and nooks, and it's kind of like a miniature. It's not as elaborate or crazy, but it's kind of like a miniature Winchester mystery house. It's got lots of strange rooms and rumors of tunnels that, run throughout the island that lead to the house, all kinds of crazy stuff. But it made most of its fame in the 70s. But let's start with the ghost history. I mentioned earlier, and this is something I love the intro because it's something I'm big on, is paranormal investigations for me is far outside of one of the more specific fields. I started with ghost hunting. Now I do a lot of UFO stuff. I'm always big on cryptids. A lot of people stay focused in their one niche, and I found that was the case here at the Betts house. And so for years, it had been a haunted location. When it was first built in the 30s, Um, it was abandoned by its original owners who all died in tragic circumstances. And so it became the local house on Haunted Hill. Kids would dare each other to go and go up to the house and peer inside the windows, and they would see lights and hear strange noises, phantom organ music, even though there's no organ inside the home. They're classic kind of spooky, ooky stories. But in the 70s, the Betts family moves in. Jerry Betts is this like icon of business. She owns a bunch of trucking companies and real estate holdings. And she was running for state Congress and all of this with the 70s background of, oh, she's a woman. There was a article. She was running for Congress at the time, and it said, how will these women keep house if they're elected? That was like the headline, top front of the paper. So it gives you an idea of some of the challenges she was against. But one day she was talking with some business partners about funding a movie, like a horror movie, and someone said, "Well, that you could use that old house out on Fort George Island that everyone thinks is haunted. That would be the perfect location." And she went out to check it out and fell in love with the house and bought it and started renovations. Um, During this time period, she and her family experienced a bunch of weird, spooky activity, poltergeist activity. Obviously, nothing like Amityville level, scare you, chase you out of the home. They're kind of like, oh, it's neat, it's weird. What a quirky home. Um, but in the 70s, they found this big metal sphere while they were walking around the island. And this is where the Betts sphere enters the story, which is probably the more famous aspect of the story. It was this large metal ball. Depending on the story version of the story, it was found within a scorched patch of foliage, like a burned circle, sitting in the middle of this. Um, and the older son, Terry, brought it home, put it in his room, and it sat there for a couple weeks until he played his guitar next to it. And then the sphere started to vibrate. And shortly after it's vibrating, it started to move around on its own. And the family said it would almost act like a pet. It would follow them around from room to room, kind of roll. There was a outside investigator who came to the house and saw the sphere move on its own. And he said it was sitting in the middle of the table. And he was like, I want to take more pictures of the house for the story I'm doing. Can we go out back and get some pictures? And Jerry was like, yeah, sure, this way. And as they went to leave the room, the sphere rolled to the edge of this flat table and kind of dangled off the edge and then wobbled back and forth. And the investigator said it was like a dog saying, hey, I want to go outside, and like wagging its tail when it sees its owners stand up and do anything. My dog's that way. He needs to know where I'm going. He wants to be involved. And it kind of had this level of intelligence. That being said, the family dog hated the thing. It would whine and freak out if it was held next to it. Um, and this story kind of took over Jacksonville and really the South tabloid scene at the time. Um, and J. Allen Hynek ended up getting involved. The Navy steps in because her husband is a contractor for them at the time, and it's sent to a naval lab for a certain amount of period. There's a whole strange saga, and there's several theories of what happened to this sphere. All of them I go into in my book, A Place Between Time and Space. But the short end of it is someone steals it and swaps it with a dummy, or they do an experiment that destroys the inner mechanisms, and this UFO sphere stops working. And so yeah, this house is kind of the epicenter of this very strange saga, which encapsulates not only ghosts and UFOs, but the island itself. It has all kinds of legends, from intensely red-eyed entities. There's Pinky, the St. John's River monster, which was first spotted in the 1800s right off the coast of Fort George Island. It's still supposedly seen up and down the St. John's today. And so this house, it is, yeah, it's if you're looking for a case of high strangeness where It's not just a Bigfoot or a haunted house. Those cases are harder to find, but Florida has one, and then that is definitely at the Betts house. So I'm big on plugging that one. You might have to bend some laws to go out and see it. It is, in the woods and on an island. It belongs, I believe the land belongs to the state. I pay taxes, so personally, I feel that I have a right to go and visit it, but others might interpret the laws differently. So use your judgment if you're out there. And again, Fort George Island, tons of history, tons of crazy stuff to check out. But of course, that's just touching the surface. There's really tons of high strangeness in Florida. We have our own brand of Bigfoot, the skunk ape, of course. Um, and I have a lot of good colleagues and friends who have run some investigations outside of Ocala into the skunk ape, and then Mayaca outside of or inland from Sarasota, kind of south east of Tampa, a few hours, an hour and a half or so. There's Mayaca State Park, which I have personally seen a fucking tiger in. I saw a tiger walking around that park once. But others have seen Bigfoots as well as tigers, all kinds of weird stuff in that pristine swamp they got over there.
I'm
So
sorry, by tiger, you mean like a Bengal tiger? Was it escaped
I
from the
think it
zoo
was
or?
I think it was an escaped because it looked like, yeah, there's the whole idea of phantom cats. And again,
Hmm.
paranormal investigator here. I'm all into that, phantom black cats in the UK. I love all those kinds of stories. And I always bring this up when people are talking about, Mayaca and the Mayaca monster, the supposed Bigfoot that's out there. I'm like, yeah, it could be a fucking tiger. And I affirm that I believe this was not a phantom tiger, but an actual tiger. And even on the ride out to if you're going from Sarasota, Florida, out to Mayaca State Park, it's probably like a 30-minute drive or so into, out into the wetlands. Um, and on the way, depending on your route, you'll drive past the big cat habitat, this sanctuary for lions and tigers and whatever. Basically, it's one of those Tiger King deals, and those are spotted all over southern Florida, especially in the central parts. And so I tend to lean towards, and when I saw it, I was canoeing with friends. Um, we were now be full honesty, full disclosure, we were smoking some joints. We were smoking some joints on this canoeing on the big lake. And on the far side of the park, where there aren't any trails, it's just wild, we see what from this distance looked like a bench. It looked like an orange painted bench. It had the slots, like the back wooden slots of a typical park bench. And so we were like, oh man, let's paddle across the lake and go like sit on that bench and hang out. And as we're getting closer, the bench stands up. I realize that the stripes are on the side of a large animal. They're not just, hollow wooden slat stripes. And it just runs off into the woods, tail swinging. And I suppose it could have been a Florida panther, but those don't typically have stripes. The stripes was the thing that made us kind of notice it. And so I lean towards that being a tiger. And during those few years around that time, there were people living in Mayaca City. Several people reported seeing tigers in the woods. One group said they saw 3 tigers out about free and loose in the woods. So I think that one I'm leaning towards actual tiger. I think that was probably the case. But again, that is a perfect example of high strangeness, that these things, when we talk about high strangeness, we talk about, the good cases, these highly strange cases is when they have something real about them. And so a bunch of actual loose tigers no one's reported is a very strange and weird thing. And especially when it's appearing alongside of these Bigfoot creatures that people are seeing pretty consistently out there. There's even a couple of famous photos, though the most famous photo of the Mayaca monster, the one that will probably pop up when you Google it. People believe that it's funny, the skeptic explanation is that, oh, that's an escaped orangutan. It's this glowing eyes and it looks freaky, but it's just because it's at night, it's in the Florida swamp. That's an escaped orangutan. Even though, again, no one knows where that orangutan escaped from. No one's reported a missing orangutan in the similar case as those tigers. So again, it's hard to say. Um, who knows? But that's those kind of where reality and urban legend kind of mix is where you'll find some strange stuff. So I have uh, some colleagues of mine did some crazy psychedelic experiments out at the Crowley Museum, which is a museum that's situated inside the Mayaca Swamp. And so they got some really crazy results. That's the skunk ape experiments. I think it's available on Amazon. But check that out if you want to see what kind of high strangeness gets involved. But from like farm animals acting crazy to all kinds of bizarre vocalizations and rocks being thrown, that kind of stuff. Some quality better than finding Bigfoot level research being done out there. In the Panhandle, more towards your area, there's of course you've got the famous Gulf Breeze sightings, which everyone lambasts Ed Walters Waters. I think it's Ed Walters. Everyone says he faked it. He was a fucking lunatic. Blah blah blah. And there's some good evidence he faked it. The only issue is though that the newspapers were getting reports of these UFOs in the dozens every night. It wasn't just Ed Walters seeing it. He's the one who took all the crazy photos and probably faked some of them. But the town was still seeing these things everywhere all the time during this flap. And so it's kind of written off, but it shouldn't be. There's certainly some more evidence going on there. And that's up where I think it's Eagland Air Force Base is situated up there, where they've also had a famous historic UFO landing. The details escape me at this moment, but I think it was in 73. Yeah, October 1973. They had a UFO hover or land, something crazy, at that Air Force base. And of course, anytime there's an Air Force base, you're going to find stories of UFOs. So whether it is cryptids or aliens or hauntings or a mix of between, Florida is not only the weirdest state when it comes to residents, I think it is up there on the weirdest state when it comes to paranormal activity.
Yeah, and I'd just like to warn my listeners, if you're in Florida, don't sit on the striped benches. um,
It's probably someone's territory at this point. Leave those for our houseless people.
so you've mentioned Bigfoot a few times, and I, before moving here, didn't realize Bigfoot was such a big deal in Florida. Because when you think of Florida, you don't think of Bigfoot, although I have seen the
Mhm.
t-shirts where he's carrying a surfboard, which are actually
Surfing
pretty
on an
cool.
alligator.
Yeah. um, but I, if I remember correctly, the term Sasquatch comes from Florida, doesn't it? Um,
I
anyway,
believe the Sasquatch is a native term. I don't think it's originally Seminole. It might be. Um, I think it's one of the ones that got moved out to like Washington and Oregon. But yeah, the Florida skunk ape, we like to call them, seems to be, a little unique.
yes.
Um,
So, have you seen any evidence that you find extremely difficult to dismiss of the existence of Bigfoot in Florida?
See, that's tough because I've had some weird experiences and things like that. But well, my personal belief of what makes me good at this is that I have a nagging skepticism in the back of my mind that never lets me truly believe. I'm always looking for explanations. And unfortunately, if you're out in the woods or in the swamp in Florida, there are so many possible explanations for what you're experiencing or hearing. And even seeing, again, we talked about the Mayaca monster, tigers and orangutans come up. There's, if we're covering any of the skunk ape stories or Sasquatch stories anywhere, of course, there's an element of tricksters, human tricksters. throwing in hoaxes, Ed Walter style when he did his UFO stunt. No one, no one here in Florida is, discounting the hoaxster idea. There's a weird bunch, eclectic group here, and absolutely someone would fake something for, just for shits. Um, so personally, I've seen some photos. I'm good friends with Stacy Brown Jr., who does some awesome research. RPG, who lives down here now. He was one of the producers and short time cast members on Finding Bigfoot. And they're down here doing their Bigfoot research, and I love going along with them, hanging out, doing it. I have yet to see convincing. And if you were, I would suggest, if you're maybe more open-minded than me when it comes to the Bigfoot stuff, I would check out Stacy Brown Jr. and his work. He's got really interesting recordings and videos and photos of, yep, something in the woods. Shrug to what it is. But there's something out there, and I've met him several times, and I believe he's doing honest investigation. So it's out there. There's certainly evidence. Maybe tomorrow, I'm the kind of guy tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll be like, you know what? I was too hard on the Bigfoot people in Florida. I believe more than I said on that podcast. But I think for the most part, when I'm approaching it, whether it is to write or to research or even for fun, I'm still thinking about all the mundane explanations that are at play. So again, I don't know. I'm not sure. But I will, while we're still on it, drop an interesting piece of skunk ape knowledge. That the terminology for skunk ape, most people assumes it's because our Bigfoots smell worse than other people's Bigfoots. And while that is consistently reported, it's consistently reported with all Bigfoots. They smell like ass, sulfur, and BO typically. Excuse me. But the skunk ape term actually comes from a famous photo taken in the Panhandle of a Bigfoot-like creature that has a white stripe down its back, kind of like Pepe Le Pew in the Looney Tunes. And the writer at the local newspaper was like, "This is clearly some kind of skunk ape man creature." And the term just stuck. And so now, even if it has the stripe or not, if it's in Florida, it's the skunk ape. So a little piece of interesting skunk ape trivia there. It's actually my low-key test to see if this Florida Bigfoot guy knows what he's talking about or not, or if he's just some guy who watches TV and he's coming out. Because if they say the first line, oh, it's because they smell bad. He hasn't been doing his research. He's getting a D in my class.
Well, I coming from a psychology background, I always have to question why is it that let's say that these are just hallucinations or delusions, or somebody's panicking in the moment and their brain just tries to blur the small pieces of information they have together to form anything that they can understand in a tangible form. And that's where Bigfoot is coming from. Why is it a mass hallucination? Why is this hallucination happening across centuries, across continents? That's a very weird place for our minds to go. That means
Absolutely.
something must have occurred with it. Let's say that Bigfoot doesn't exist anymore. Something must have occurred somewhere inside of our subconscious that's drawing that forward to us. And I also wonder if perhaps there's some sort of spiritual energies with the woods that we don't have any scientific measurements for it or ways of weighing it and knowing it in any physical form, but our subconscious picks it up and relays it to us in this Bigfoot form. I don't know. That's just hypothesizing.
No, I personally think you're onto something there. I've been exploring that kind of route of theory through all of my paranormal investigations because it does come to the closest. And of course, I'm not the first to broach these subjects from that perspective. I mean, Carl Jung had his archetypes, and that's you'll still see that terminology thrown up, and that dates from good old true psychology, not just parapsychology. But again, for me, that even that semi-scientific explanation, we're now entering a third party into the equation, right? This archetype, because the archetype obviously exists beyond the individual. If someone is seeing crazy hyper specific monsters and freaking out, well, it's schizophrenia. They have a mental illness. But why are all these people who aren't on some kind of typical mental illness scale, if you want to call it that, typical people seeing the same thing in these same locales across the world? There's, well, an archetype, whatever you want to call it, an entity, Bigfoot. It is now a third party. And whatever the third party, the true nature of that third party is elusive. We still don't understand it. No matter skeptic, paranormal, whoever's saying they understand it, they're lying. We don't have an understanding of it yet. But that third party is the paranormal. And I think Bigfoot is actually a really good exercise in recognizing that, because Bigfoot is essentially, if you do a Bigfoot investigation, you'll come away with it realizing, and a ghost hunting investigation, or if you just watch both the shows, you can find that the details are strikingly similar. Bigfoot, it usually starts with wood knocks. That's usually the basic entry. That's also the first thing a poltergeist does. If you go back to the original Fox sisters poltergeist case in the 1800s, when they started using that term to describe haunted buildings, that original poltergeist was started with these knocks, 2 for yes, or 1 for yes, 2 for no, I believe. Bigfoot starts with the knocks. Then you get the vocalizations. Hold on, let me yell at my dog for 1 second. All right, speaking of unwanted vocalizations. um, so vocalizations is usually the next step when it comes to Bigfoot um, and poltergeist, right? You start hearing growls, snarls, and again, usually it's those sounds, whether it's Bigfoot or poltergeist. In the poltergeist cases, you might hear language. Sometimes they hear that reported in Bigfoot cases too, weird words and growls and things. Um, the next step is usually for Bigfoot rock throwing, right? Pebbles and things being chucked, apples, all kinds of stuff being thrown. And that is the poltergeist cup of tea. That's when most investigators consider it to have evolved from a haunting to a physical poltergeist cases, when the stuff starts throwing. In that same category, you have Bigfoot, the structures people find in the woods. The day after they had this weird interaction, they heard some weird noises, some rocks were thrown at the tent. They walk towards the direction of where those rocks came from, and there's a bunch of sticks piled up in a weird, clearly intentional way, almost like a shelter or like modern art, Blair Witchy kind of shit. The structure type of thing. Again, if you're in a house, a poltergeist might stack your chairs up in a weird way, or pull all the pans out of the drawers and stack them in strange formations, balance teacups on the top of lamps and things like that. Oftentimes reported in poltergeist cases. So again, the phenomenon is behaving the same way up until level 5, if you want to call it that, where you actually see the apparition. And when you see the apparition of Bigfoot, yeah, if it's in the daytime, it's a big hairy guy, but usually at night, it's a pair of glowing eyes and a shadow moving, which again is the exact same thing people report during poltergeist cases. So clearly, that doesn't necessarily mean they're the same thing, but whatever function that allows us as human beings to experience this third party archetype, it's the same function. Our mind in physical experiences is going again essentially through this checklist of activity. Now, if you're in the woods, it's a Bigfoot. If you're in a house from the 1800s, well, now you got a ghost. And it seems to be something that, again, people have pointed out these parallels in alien abduction as well. A lot of these strange activities start to pick up, and it's the when the archetype, the third party, when it starts physically interacting with the environment, that is when it piques my interest. Because again, I get the like tinnitus every once in a while, and I can't tell whether that's in my head or outside my head. And it always reminds me that, if people are hearing shit, again, who knows where that's coming from? But a bunch of people are hearing shit and rocks are being thrown at them. Well, now something's happening. Something physically is happening. Even the impact leaving the footprint behind, a physical effect on the environment. Same way that UFOs that land supposedly leave indentations into the ground or scorch marks. There's a physical crossover onto our reality. And that's what's paranormal. And when you are coming from that approach, it's pretty hard not to start to notice the similarities between all of these subgroups, the cryptozoologists and the ghost hunters and the ufologists. They are, without knowing it, essentially all studying the same phenomenon.
Hmm. When it comes to ghosts, apparitions, poltergeists, and the like, um, I feel like we discount it so easily in this modern age because we think that time periods can't be captured in any way. But
Mm-hmm.
look at us now. We're capturing not only your image and my image, but our vocalizations as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're capturing something that's happening right now in a physical form, corporeal form. And so perhaps there is something that happens with any living creature. If it has an event in its life, there's a timestamp on that it's a recording. It's not on film or what have you. It's not
Mm-hmm.
in the cloud, but it's some sort of other version of the cloud that is natural, the Akashic field or something. And perhaps there's this time space overlap where, there's parallel realms where we capture these images and things that
Mm-hmm.
are recorded by time. Maybe that's what we're experiencing when we experience ghosts and the like.
Oh yeah, I'm for Paranormality magazine. One of our writers, Kajersti Beth, check all of her stuff out. She's a phenomenal researcher in these fields, and she did a great multi-part series for the magazine on stone tape theory. This idea that solid stone and objects record some kind of energetic memory, and then one that's more interesting because it actually has some more shit to back it up is the water tape theory, suggesting that bodies of water can be influenced by, you know, energetic information and hold some kind of trace of that. But again, it also could be, in my personal belief, I'm a big fan of the theory of biocentrism as explained by Dr. Robert Lanza. There's several different versions, these days. You can't come up with a term without it being hijacked for something. But Dr. Robert Lanza's biocentrism is the book I'm always thinking of when I talk about it. But this idea that and it's being backed up with quantum science, which I'm not going to get into because I'm here to talk about ghosts. But I think a lot of people who are into these subjects understand like the slit experiment and how particles aren't in a solid state unless they're being observed. So biocentrism takes that concept to, its kind of zenith and suggesting that, well, without observation, then none of what we experience as reality exists in a more physical level than just obviously if there's no humans, there's no society kind of level. It's basically, a tree falls in the forest, doesn't make a sound, Biocentrism would say yes, because you said it's a forest. So all the other plant trees would feel the vibration, the bugs would feel the vibration, the mammals would hear the vibrations, yada yada. Now, if there's a stone pillar falling on a dead world, does that make a sound? No, there's nothing to experience that sound. It doesn't escape its atmosphere. It just, there's no experience there. And, from this idea, it explores, is dark matter in our reality? Is that just unobserved, unrendered map if you're a video game player? Is that just the edges of the map we haven't unlocked because there's just nothing out there experiencing that? And in turn, does that mean the things we have seen that are mapped, does that imply that there must be some biological observance over there to generate it? Or is our ability to generate it so powerful that it's just us? Which again, who knows? But this kind of mystery, I think, looking at these mysteries from that perspective, I think answers a lot of questions. And so when I think of stone tape, water tape, I kind of go back and go into human tape theory, where others might call it genetic memory, where, past lives are recorded in our genes somehow and that kind of stuff. I feel that it's more likely, I prefer the term collective unconsciousness. And that's also very Jungian, but I have a more occult perspective of where it's the cloud essentially. And while we're each individual computers or meat computers inside our heads processing information, a certain amount of that information, obviously downloaded to our memories and things like that, because we can destroy parts of the brain and lose those things and those functions, those concepts and ideas. But some of it gets uploaded to this cloud, this neural network, that connects all of us subconsciously. And that's, it explains some of the other weird things of history, such as co-creation of certain technologies. You'll have like peoples in Africa and Asia coming up with the same kind of writing system at the same time, even though they're completely separate. You'll have, the invention of the telephone was done. We're always taught, because Rock, Flag, and Eagle, America, Graham Bell. But Marconi in Italy invented the exact same thing at the exact same time, and his was actually better. And he died. He actually disappeared on the train ride to the Paris World's Fair and was never seen again. Never exhibited his technology or whatever. Fucking Edison got him. That's a whole theory. Anyways, whole sidetrack. But the reason these things occur perhaps is because of this unconsciousness. It's something so influential that it spreads automatically through this shared network. You also see it in family groups, right? A mother knows her child's in danger, or a wife knows her husband's been killed on the battlefield before. Even the official reports make it back to the generals on the front lines. Those kind of things. And so I think that a lot of hauntings or archetypes like Bigfoot, I think they can exist within this neural network. And again, it sounds kind of crazy, occult, sci-fi, but actually it's decently understood biology. I mean, most insect hives are understood to operate under a similar principle, where clearly they're acting almost automatically under a one controlled kind of idea. And obviously you can irritate an individual bug and it'll react individually, but on the whole, they operate in very, mathematical, precise ways, as if they're sharing a consciousness. We see it in wolves and dogs and any kind of pack animal. There's a great study that shows that like your dog will know if you're heading home, even if your schedule is completely different. You went to the dentist instead of going home at the normal time and you're 2 hours early. The dog at home will start to react whenever you start like, all right, time to go home. It starts to show like the heart rate goes up and like the whole thing. It's a really fascinating study. And so it's seeming like we can share this with other mammals. It's, I think, only a logical conclusion that this is just some kind of biological function. Any kind of organism that's made it so far. And again, it's you see it in fish, the schools of fish that swim all in one direction as if they're one organism. And it's all when they do the mathematics of how precise it is, it blows their minds. And it seems to not only be a function present in mammals, but in the lower forms of what we would call, I suppose, organisms, lower organisms. It's a reptilian brain function. Like it's something we probably developed way back when, billions of years ago, when we were still slime molds or whatever. And so I think that when you account for how present some that kind of mechanism is in nature, you gotta probably recognize, well, we probably have it too. So how does that manifest in day-to-day waking life? And I think a lot of paranormal activity, it can be explained by cultural interpretations of that experience.
So you briefly mentioned bees, and you have yourself a very interesting bee theory. I haven't listened to it in quite a while, so can you give me a refresher course or some sort of overview on that?
Absolutely. Okay, so listener, throw out everything I just said because I'm going to tell you a tale of how collective unconsciousness, archetypes, toilet flush. Who needs any of that when there's a much more simple explanation, and that is the bees. Uh, so this is a story I've been working on. Oh God, it'll be 8 years this summer. And I was hoping to get a book out this year, and I've been working on it for years now, and I realized that I'm not even close to this year. It's going to be something I'm going to continue to work on for another few years at least, because every time I think I'm done with the story's not done with me. Um, but it started in Morocco when I was 19. I was backpacking, doing some adventuring. I was still researching paranormal, urban legend kind of stuff, writing it for a little WordPress blog that no one read. But I was out and about, out in the field, cutting my teeth, volunteering in random places of the world, and learning all kinds of strange occultism and looking into paranormal legends and belief systems and that kind of stuff. And in Morocco, I met this dude who had some very interesting family history, so we claim. Dad worked for the CIA, and this was outside of Tangier, which anyone's up on their North African history was the international zone um, after World War II through the 50s, kind of this like city surrounded by this buffer zone that was controlled by all of the European countries and the Sultan of Morocco and this weird kind of strange truce. King of Morocco, excuse me. He doesn't use the Sultan term. But it essentially became a crime hub for international smuggling. It was the effect of having this free city because no one really knew how to enforce laws or what laws to enforce. Um, but oh, my camera cut out. But the human smuggling, drug smuggling, all that kind of stuff became quite in vogue. And so naturally, the OSS and its its successor, the CIA, were very active in the region. Big spy hub, intelligence hub. If you go back and watch old spy movies, they're always going to Tangier. It's like always on the list. I think there's even an Archer episode where they go to pay homage to that greasy time period of that city. And so this dude still lived on the outskirts of Tangier. He lived in like the like neighborhood of the aristocracy. Like his next door neighbor, it was a vacation home for the Spanish princess. And he lived in this weird digs, didn't work or anything. And all he would say, oh, my dad worked for the CIA. That was it. Weird guy, older dude too. So dad was definitely working back in the day. Um, And he very casually, I was writing for a blog, and you find these kind of groups of people to travel with, and we were hanging out at this apartment doing hash rips out of a gravity bong. And this dude was like, "So you write about UFOs and stuff?" The guy who had the apartment, he's like, "I got a guy you got to meet. I'm gonna set up this meeting," um, because this dude was crazy and he wanted me to meet him. I was like, "Hell yeah!" And we met at this weird roadside cafe. He later invited me for a second meeting at his place. Um, but he told me very nonchalantly, "Oh yeah, no, I know people who fly UFOs. It's human tech, but they based it off of honeybees." Super casually, like he had everyday information. He's like, "Yeah, they reverse engineered an anti-gravity chamber in the thorax, and that's the technology that they use to, make UFOs." And I was like, "Okay, sure." I was like, "Whatever, dude." I was like, "This guy's just fucking crazy. What a good story." But what a crazy story. I'm not going to even really bother taking notes or any much details. He was fun to talk to and theorize with. He even told me, "Yeah, I could like get you a ride on one of those UFOs." Still waiting for him. George, send them to my door. Um, but um, yeah, very casually dropped one of the craziest things I'd ever heard, and kind of just disappeared. And years later, I was working on my first book, which was a case in Chile in South America. Um, and the friendship case exploring this group of tall, blonde, supposed extraterrestrials that were very active throughout Patagonia, people seeing them and having high strangeness interactions. I was also naturally tall blonde. I had to explore the Nazi explanation, escaped to South America, perhaps some SS officers, and pretended to be aliens. Um, and I even visited a former Nazi compound down there in southern Chile. But in writing this chapter about this explanation, I had to get into the theories of, did the Nazis have flying saucers? And anyone who's into ufology has come across this at one point or another. But there is the legend of the Nazi bell, which, legend be damned, it's essentially confirmed through official documents that they did have a giant bell-shaped object under one of these top secret research facilities. It had these big cooling towers. No one knows what it did or what it was doing. The top theory by historians is that it was a nuclear centrifuge, a kind of like a crucial processing equipment in making a nuclear bomb. It's how you like refine the uranium or whatever. And the official historical explanation is why we beat the Nazis is that they were using heavy fluids instead of using uranium and other whatever. Again, not a scientist. I want to make that when I get into the sciencey stuff, double check that. I am expert in the ghosty stuff, as close as there one can be, I suppose. The other sciencey stuff, double check that. But that's the main theory. Obviously, the fun theory is that it was an anti-gravity device and that Nazis had built the Foo Fighters and had this UFO technology. And when I was writing about this theory in my book, I mentioned that, and one time I met this dude in Morocco, and he said it was based off bees, and a bell kind of looks like the ass end of a bee, and so maybe that's something. It was literally a paragraph or two, and when the book came out, I didn't really expect anyone to read it, but it was pretty popular on some podcasts and shows. It was being talked about, and people started inviting me on, and one show invited me on, and the host was super hyped about that paragraph. And I was like, "The B paragraph?" And he was like, "Yes." Because when he was younger, his closest childhood friend had a dad who worked in military intelligence. They were always, military bases and that kind of stuff. And anytime they asked him what he did, he would kind of like half jokingly say, "Oh, I'm a man in black. I'm a man in black, like in the movies." And so they were like, "Okay, so aliens and UFOs, something about that." And on his deathbed, supposedly the son asked him for more information, and all he would say was, "Think about the bees," or "Look at the bees, look at the bees." And so they had always assumed it was like something about how bees communicate, and like that's how they like talked to the aliens or something like that until he read the paragraph in my book and was like, oh shit, that's it. The bees have an anti-gravity chamber in their thorax, and the Nazis reverse engineered it. And that's where UFOs come from. And naturally, the Allies have captured this technology. Um, and so again, that was like a breakthrough moment. Like, oh shit. Like that is super strange. Now I have two super shady, totally unreliable supposed military intelligence sources that are saying the bees. And for a paranormal investigator, man, that's about as good as it gets. So I began a deep dive into this concept where I eventually came across using the Wayback Machine on some weird old websites that aren't around anymore. Um, I found the writings of a Russian scientist named Viktor Gerbinikov. Um, and he was an entomologist, a bug guy for a university in Siberia. He was a real dude. There's still like a branch of entomology named after him at this one university. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a memoir where he talks about all of his insect-based accomplishments, his, cutting his teeth researching scarab beetles in Turkey, then solving this alfalfa pest crisis for the Siberian farms and saving the alfalfa crops. Um, and then he writes chapter 13. Oh, yeah, that one time I built a UFO. And that's obviously when I'm like, what the fuck? That's where my interest peaks. And he claimed that with photos, he built this essentially a pallet with handlebars. It was like a scooter's handlebars. Um, and he said that he built this UFO using not the thorax of honeybees, but the shells, the wing flaps of heavy flying insects, where he literally took a bunch of them, stitched them together, put them in these blocks that would seemingly defy gravity. They'd be like heavy blocks. You could tap it lightly and it'd fly up to the ceiling and float back down, kind of like a balloon. Um, he got a bunch of these blocks, again, which, as far as we can tell, are just filled with insect wing shells, according to the story. He stitched them in some formation, in some kind of stacked, layered system, I believe. But again, he doesn't go into. There's no like exact how I did it. It's just, oh yeah, I did this one time. Um, and supposedly this flying pallet machine would operate. And so again, at this point, I'm like, still insane. None of this is believable. But I started to read what he wrote about the side effects of using the craft. And basically everything I described earlier of like the similarities between Bigfoot and poltergeists, anywhere he would operate the craft frequently would start to have poltergeist-like activity. When he was flying the craft and people would look up, he would always note that they would never see a man flying a pallet. They would see glowing shapes, discs or triangles or tubes. Again, listed your classic UFO shapes. Um, he also started talking about some super high strangeness stuff. On one incident, he would fly this out to do research at these remote Siberian research fields, get the pristine samples that no one can get to but he can because he can fly out. Which again, he attributed a lot of his stellar research to being able to do this. But he put a larva once in this vial, put it in his pocket, got back on the UFO, flew back to his lab, about an hour and a half flight. And when he took out the larva, it was fully grown, something that would normally take months for that kind of insect. And so he had all kinds of weird time bending anomalies. On another instance, he dropped one of these test tubes off the side of the craft above this apartment building. But he noted that it didn't fall to the ground and smash on the roof. It blipped out of existence. And then when he went back to the apartment building later, there were all these perfectly burned holes in the windows. And one window looked like it had part of a test tube infused in it. And that's the kind of like Philadelphia experiment stuff. There's actually part that I found really interesting about that is John Keel wrote about that same effect, the little holes in the windows during the Mothman case. If the Mothman flew over your house, you might have a couple of those little perfectly burned, singed holes in your window. Which again, fascinating. There's some what a hyper specific detail of high strangeness to put in there. And so it got to a point where, well, is this guy lying? How if he is, he's not only a great entomologist, he's an excellent paranormal researcher. And he has hidden it up until this moment where he's writing this one chapter in his memoir. And again, that is still probably the most likely explanation. But interestingly, he said that after using it for a while, the incident with the bug, he was like, well, one, what is it doing to my organs? Like, what does it do to me internally flying this thing around, getting on and off of it? But two, he also noted at this time he started looking into UFOs more because obviously he realized he had built one. And he determined that, well, someone else has built these because people are seeing them all over the globe. And so I'm just going to put this away and not get myself in trouble. And again, this was the 80s, 90s, right around the fall of the Soviet Union. And so he grew up under the Soviets and he obviously highly suspicious of government. I would probably keep that shit to myself being an American. I don't trust my government enough not to shoot me in the head to hide that kind of secret. And so that's supposedly his explanation of I just put it away and never told anybody. And I just, I'm getting it off my chest here towards the end of my life, writing this memoir. And he did die shortly after the memoir was released in the early 90s. And his son was communicating with this researcher, sharing all this information, getting the translations, original scans of the memoir from Siberia to this guy. And then this guy went dark, seemingly passed away in the late 2000s. And that's kind of where the active investigation of the story has died off. There's still some weird old heads on the internet who are like still dedicated to this theory. They must have been involved, when it was first happening and they're like really into it. But I've also found a lot of interesting propaganda that I think is kind of intentional. If you look up Gorbanikov, you can find this like YouTube video that always pops up, and it features photos of him and his craft, the actual photos. But then it shows this like soldier flying around on a device that kind of looks like his pallet machine, but it has walls. And they're like, see, clearly it works. But that device it's a Soviet technology that was tested in the 80s. It's a helicopter. It's basically one of those big like quadruped drones that's powerful enough for someone to stand on. It's very simple, known technology. It looks cool, kind of looks like a weird UFO, kind of looks like Gorbaниkov's thing. But that video is always surfaced every time people talk about it. The video that mixed his legitimate videos with that fake video. And every time people are like, well, obviously that's fake because that part of the video is fake. It's fake Soviet technology. And they throw out all the Gorbanikov stuff. And I think that's intentional. If a B theory Chaz is working, I think they're covering it up. Potentially. Again, who knows? It could just be a fan of the theory who saw it and wanted to legitimize it. Again, it's difficult, but that has led me into one of his other things. Again, a legitimately understood effect called the CSE effect, which is this cavity structure effect. And he discovered it in regards to insect nests. They give off this special electromagnetic field that penetrates solid subject surfaces. And insect nests have it. Supposedly, a lot of the shells of heavy flying insects have these patterns integrated into the microscopic fragmentation of their wings and things. It's very bizarre and sciencey, but it is a real effect, and people are still writing scientific papers about the CSE effect. I get a couple sent to me a year where they're like, look at this, the CSE effect proves this other effect, or they're using CSE to medically treat this one thing. It's a very legitimate effect. But it also, when you really get into Gurbinikov's writings, who discovered it, it essentially gets to this like ether level where it's like the force in Star Wars, where like it permeates everything. And of course, he's not the only scientist to have found something like that, this alternative energy, infinite free energy. Um, he found it naturally occurring in insects, but there's other scientists, Wilhelm Reich of orgone energy, which I'm not sure if you're ever familiar with that concept. Have you ever heard of orgone energy?
No, I have not.
Um, so that one is, ooh, hold on one second. My computer's acting up. They're trying to silence me. All right. Shit. Shit. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you. There
Okay.
you are.
Okay. Okay. Cool. I've been getting weird glitches. All right. um, but Wilhelm Reich is cool. All right, I feel like I keep cutting you off. Okay, cutting myself off. All right. Wilhelm Reich, orgone energy. He was a psychologist. He actually trained with Freud. He was in the same class as Jung. He started his career in a lot of sexual therapy and theories. You know, he was one of the first people to be like, you know, you could let people be gay. Um, which again has become a controversial subject once again, but we're not here to discuss that. Supposedly, he also discovered a similar ether-like phenomenon that he called orgone energy because he discovered it through the therapeutic effect by studying the therapeutic effects of orgasms, not only in people but animal husbandry and shit. But essentially, that it's really healthy to have orgasms actually, and that you shouldn't not like masturbate and things like that, you know, in whatever. Again, let's not get into the politics, but supposedly he discovered a similar energy through his research. And in the later part of his lives, he became a mad scientist, depending on who you ask. Um, but he built these orgone accumulators, these giant wooden triangles, pyramids that people would sit in and supposedly receive really beneficial medical effects. And if you go into any new age shop today, you will see them selling orgone accumulators. They're little resin pyramids filled with like metal shavings and crystals and shit like that. I don't know where the fuck that came from. Wilhelm Reich never did any shit like that. Again, planned opposition. They planted that in the new age shops to make us all think orgone energy is bullshit. Um, Again, I'm conspiratorial here, but uh, the actual orgone accumulators were these large objects that people could actually sit inside of, and they were triangles, and supposedly they naturally channeled this orgone energy, and they could help reduce tumors and things like that. And he had consistent people signing up for it. um, and we'll get back to that because it gets him in trouble. He also invented something he called the cloud buster, which ironically, we are seeing that technology used right now in Dubai to devastating effects. Um, Again, they've always said Wilhelm Reich was insane and that his shit didn't exist. But his cloud buster was this giant pipe turret thing. It was large. It had to be like fastened to the back of a truck. Um, and he would point it to the sky, fire it, and after like 15, 20 minutes, a rainstorm would appear and it would rain. Or he could use it in the reverse. He could use it to get rid of rain. And he was paid throughout the New England to do this, like consistently on his taxes, farmers giving him money to water their crops because it was cheaper than the new fertilizer and watering systems. He went all over doing it. And then he went to Arizona and used it down there for a few years to water crops to great success. Again, being paid consistently by these companies the entire time. Um, but then as a lot of these stories go, the ATF was like, you're selling medical shit without a license, which again, ATF, but still not their wheelhouse, not alcohol, tobacco, or firearms. They're always doing shit they shouldn't be doing. Fuck those guys. But they are like, you're doing medical shit without a proper license. You know, he was a licensed therapist, but he wasn't licensed to do cancer treatments and things like that. They lock him up, and he dies in prison in their custody, like a year into the custody, after they raid his laboratories and take all of his writings, everything he's ever written, all of his documentations, any prototypes or things that weren't nailed to the floor were took. And supposedly, when asked about where all that stuff went, they burned it. They said, "Oh, we burned it all." Incinerator in New York, which New York was his laboratories in Maine. So they drove it across 4 states and burned all of it in a different city. Sure. Um, but yeah, they took all of his shit. He died, ostracized in prison. To this day, though, you can still go to Organon, his ranch in Maine, where he did most of these experiments, and they have whatever remnants of his research and technology there. But where he really ties into our story is, one, the Cloudbuster looks like a prototype of Gorbanov's CSE devices. All of his CSE channeling, artificial beehives and things like that he was making to prove the CSE effect. The Cloudbuster lines up perfectly with what they look like. Essentially a big thing of pipes all bunched together. And supposedly anything like that has multiple holes, it's kind of that, what's that phobia where people are afraid of like a bunch of tiny holes. Um, Supposedly anything with that gives off a CSE effect, which might explain the phobia. But this Cloudbuster looks exactly like Gorbanov's things that he was building. And Reich, and more importantly, his son, writes of a bunch of times when they used the Cloudbuster to shoot at UFOs, and the UFOs would like buckle and like zoom off and like fade into the distance. And they were convinced that whatever, whatever the UFOs were operating on orgone energy. They were using the same principles that his Cloudbuster was, and that's why his Cloudbuster could essentially take them out of the air. And he called the Air Force multiple times to let him know. And multiple times the family wrote about like fighter jets would fly over the farm, and then one of the UFOs would show up. And Wilhelm Reich was obsessed with that it was aliens, and that we got to defend the planet. And so he was like, why is the Air Force just missing them? They're too late or too early or da 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 da. And I'm sitting here in 2024 being like, man, they were fucking with you. They wanted you to test the technology and think it was aliens, and that's why they were flying over you. They were monitoring you. They aren't monitoring the UFO. They're checking you out for fucking with their UFO. Again, that's where my mind's headed towards. So he's only one of several scientists, Gorbachev and Reich, whose storylines follow very similar routes, where they discover this crazy technology and they either hide it or they go public and something terrible happens to them. And so every time I'm like, oh, that one fits the list, I've got to add it to the book. And so the book keeps expanding. But it's this consistent parallel story. And that's why I call it bee theory, because it's not only because of the bees. And actually, Gorbachev research would suggest any heavy flying insect. So that's bees, scarab beetles, which again, I have a whole chapter of the implications of scarab beetles in this technology when it regards to ancient sites. Because again, this theory, it does correlate with everything. It is a very flushed out theory. Not everything. There's definitely holes still. I'm not sure how Bigfoot fits into any of this. but um, it's certainly parallel theory. And while my A theory is the collective unconsciousness, this the machinations of these unknown biological functions of perception paired with evolution and weird physics. A theory, sciencey gobbledygook, if you will, quantum whatever. But B theory is B theory for me. It's something I'm always thinking about when I'm investigating these things is could it be that simple? Are we all just looking way too hard and thinking about it way too hard? And could that also explain? I'll end on this point because this one always fucks me up. Is that if you look at the amount of UFO sightings, because according to Grabinikoff, you need the actual wing shells to make this effect. That's the most effective way to build the craft. If you look at the amount of UFO sightings from, modern era up to now, and the population of all insects, but especially heavily flying insects, it's an X. UFO sightings go up, insect populations go down. Again, causation, not correlation. Who knows? Or correlation is not causation. That could be anything, but it spooks me out every time I think about this theory. And if we are, as people suggest, on the brink of World War III, our insect populations are crazy low. There's all kinds of dark doomsday experiments, research being done about how crops and stuff are going to start collapsing because we don't have enough bugs. And here in Florida, you're new, but this is something huge for us. Love bugs. Love bugs used to be everywhere. Now you don't get a love bug. There's no love bugs. Roly polies, the same. They used to be everywhere. I haven't seen a roly poly in years, and I'm still looking. I actually saw one a couple months ago, but not as many as you would expect. It just seems to be mosquitoes and those cockroaches, those big flying ones that survive. Start using those for UFOs. God damn it. It was two birds with one stone. But that is, in its essence, B theory, the alternative explanation of human-based ufology.
So if I would have been able to draw to mind the technical term for phobia of holes, I would have had a chance to make myself seem very intelligent, but I blew my shot there. But I think B theory is a great place to wrap this up. And so I'll just end it with, do you have any plugs, products, or promotions? How can my listeners find you?
Yeah, you can find me on all the social medias. I don't post on them much, but you can find me there at Chaz of the Dead. You can find me on Substack at Chaz of the Dead or Dead Stack, one of those two. That's where I'm doing most of my writing these days, doing all kinds of weird deep dives into cryptids and high strangeness cases. Yeah, I'm gonna say high strangeness cases from around the globe. Right now, covering this one out of Namibia that is part ghost, part UFO, part flying snake. So if any of that sounds interesting, go check out my Substack. And then check out Paranormality Magazine. I write for them every month, whether I'm doing interviews or crazy articles. And we have an awesome team who covers all kinds of stuff from, the ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, and all the crazy, weird people that are in between those fields, whether they're artists, writers, TV personalities. We talk to them all and get all the opinions. So if you like that kind of high strangeness mixed bag, definitely check out Paranormality Magazine. And you can use code Chaz at checkout to save a little money.
That's a great promotion there. Couldn't have done it better myself. This has been a very fascinating, thought-provoking conversation. I'm very glad that I had you on the show. And a lot of the topics you brought up, I would love to cover that. And I have a billion questions more floating in my brain. So maybe I can have you back on the show one of these days, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime I can talk for hours about this stuff. So I'd love to come back and do it again. Thanks for having me.
Radio. Thank you for coming on. You take care.
Peace.
Please visit shitshooting101.com for more episodes, videos, blogs, and more to come. And if generosity compels you, go to the donation tab to help support the show to continue with no ads and no paywall. Either way, we appreciate your listens, follows, likes, and shares. Keep shit shooting, my fellow shit shooters, and bullshit be damned.
When you go to bed, the sun has fallen. When you awaken, the sun rises again. This happens day after day. It's predictable. The system, the regiment, the cycle. It's the stale, the stagnant, the over and over again. All is nothing but normal. So it seems. Most questions end with unrequited question marks, and most is a question. Answers are but a curtain to a window revealing a world of whimsical wonders unknown and unseen endlessly. The amazing, the peculiar, the extraordinary. These are the norm, untapped by normalized vision. See the strange, begin the bizarre, fantasize the fantastic, but most of all, embrace the weird. It'll take you somewhere else, and somewhere else is quite a visit, my friends. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.